So good afternoon and welcome to Sense Making Conversations. My name is Andrea Sampson, and I'll be your host and guide today as we delve deeply into the issues that are impacting us all. Now, change is something we've all had to deal with over the past 12 months. I mean, our personal and professional lives have been impacted, but so have our cities. With almost 80% of professional work now being done from home, downtown, the downtown is empty. I mean, office towers are quiet, transit ridership is down, and traffic patterns have changed. And what about our desire to continue to live in a city? This question had me thinking about how our cities will look in the not too distant future. Now, over the past couple of years, I've done a ton of work with Singularity University, and we often talked about the future of cities, but it was often through the lens of technology, the self-driving cars or technology-enabled community spaces, and even the impact of the digital nomad, the person who, the worker that didn't have a permanent space. But with the impact of lockdowns and social isolation, our cities are empty and quiet. And I wonder what impact this is going to have on how we build, imagine, and govern them going forward. And I'm also left to wonder, what is a city? Is it a collection of people, of businesses, of ideologies? Do these create or impact our identity? I mean, truthfully, I wasn't sure. I was really pondering this question. So I took it to my friend and my guest today, Zahra Ebrahim. Zahra is a public interest designer, a civic entrepreneur, and a leader. Zahra has led one of Canada's first social design studios, archiTEXT, working with communities to co-design towards better social outcomes and leading some of Canada's most ambitious and participatory infrastructure and policy programs. Currently, she's the CEO and co-founder of Monumental, focused on creating fair and just cities and institutions in support of an equitable recovery. Zahra has taught at OCADU, MoMA, and currently teaches at the University of Toronto Scarborough. She serves on many civic boards and was recently named as Next City's Vanguard 40 Under 40 Civic Leader, Ascend Canada's Mentor of the Year, one of tomorrow's Titans in Toronto Life, and one of WXN's top 100 women in Canada. Zahra, it is an absolute pleasure and honor to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Andrea. As I was saying before, there's so much to talk about, and in such a short amount of time. So I'm thrilled. You're just one of my favorite people to riff and play with. So this is gonna be fun.
This is going to be fun. And, before we get started, I just want to do a shout out to our live audience. Remember, you get to be part of this conversation too. So go ahead, ask questions in the chat. We're monitoring, and we'll invite you to speak with us live as we get to those questions. So, Zahra, I guess my first question, as I was pondering through this is, what is a city? I mean, how can a city be equitable, and why do we choose to live in them?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and we chatted about this a little bit before, and I was reflecting on it this morning. To me, a city is a collection of ambitions, right? It's the representation, it's the outward manifestation of this sort of kaleidoscope of ambitions, ideas, aspirations, ideologies, to your earlier point, that show up in sort of a set of networks and systems and places and spaces. And so, for that reason, because it's such an expression of the moment, it's an expression of who we are, it's an expression of the zeitgeist, where we are at as a society. What makes a city equitable is that everyone is represented in that expression, and those systems serve and look like and really sort of affirm, right, the values and the ambitions of all of those who live there. And I think that's why, we're constantly having this conversation about who runs the city, who determines, what our the outward manifestation of our city looks like. And historically, I think we've this moment, this pandemic moment, has shown us that that all of the cries for more, not just some folks to be sort of engaged in that process is critical, because the systems sort of were failing the ambitions and the needs and the ideas of those, of so many of, it's not even those most vulnerable, it's
Mhm.
of women, of all sorts of folks,
Yeah.
through this time.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing lots of statistics around what the impact, of course, in this moment. This is such a, I mean, we hear it all the time. It's the unprecedented, but it's a historic moment that we're in right now. And because we're seeing such dramatic change that's happening, those who are most vulnerable are affected. And so
Yeah.
this comes to that idea of equity. I mean, like, tell me, like, maybe help to unpack, what does an equitable city look like? What is that?
It's funny, like, when people in the space that I work in talk about an equitable city, a lot of them talk about the stuff, right? We talk about housing, we talk about transit access, we talk about the sort of tangible infrastructure, which is hugely important. And when we think about an equitable city, and we think about all of the things that we need to not just live our lives, but to experience joy, to experience connection, to experience some kind of realization of parts of our identity that we want to explore, infrastructure matters, right? So that's sort of like, we need to live in houses and homes that dignify us. We need to have transit and infrastructure that serves us. One of the things, I chair a board of an organization called Park People, and we've seen unprecedented growth during this time because people are discovering their parkettes, their neighborhood parks. We're not just going to High Park, we're not just going to Tommy Thompson. We're going wherever we can. And so I think when we talk about an equitable city, having access to that capital I infrastructure, which I'm defining as tangible things that you can see and touch and experience, is as important as an equitable city that invests in social infrastructure. And that is knowing people, knowing each other, feeling connected, feeling
Mm.
safe, feeling part of something, whatever that is, feeling part of a neighborhood, feeling part of a community, whatever, an employment, sort of community, like a job community, where you, a workplace. And so I think that one of the things that an equitable city needs to be on the other side of this pandemic, if this is truly an unprecedented moment, then history will look back, right? And they'll say, so what changed? And I think the piece that I keep, when we met years ago, Andrea, I was sort of trying to encourage people to pay for social infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? I was like, "This is a thing, I
Yeah.
promise." And what I was asking for, and now I'm finding that I don't need to be so exasperated because people sort of understand it, is pay for trust building, right?
Mm.
Municipalities, philanthropies, charities, be investing in building networks of trust and support and connection, because those in crisis hold us up. Right? It was the mutual aid networks that went
Right.
door to door and knocked on people's front doors and said, how are you? Like, do you need anything? Right. And so an equitable city invests in both. And you can see and feel the expressions and the support of that infrastructure every single day, not just in crisis moments, right?
So social and hard infrastructure, we need to
Yeah.
think about that. And I think what is so wise about that, I think when we think of cities, we do tend to think of hard infrastructure. We think of the buildings, we think of the parks, we think of the roadways, but we don't think of the people.
Yes.
We forget about the people, actually, because, and certainly right now, as we see I live downtown and I look out my window, and where, a year ago, well, more than a year ago now, I would have looked out and have seen people hurrying to their next appointment, or, people walking their dog, or children. I actually have a school that's right across the street from me, seeing the kids out at lunchtime right now. Today, I look out into that same park and see, just a smattering of people, very few,
Yeah.
and people staying away from each other, right? Because we're in this place of social distancing right now. And so we forget that, that the city is made up of those who are inhabiting it, but yet we have a city that is not as inhabited as it once was. So those social infrastructures, I think, have been impacted.
Mhm.
And so, how do we, so as I look at that and go, okay, so we're talking about building community in a place that has traditionally, especially in downtown city cores,
Mm.
has traditionally been less community oriented, more business oriented. And, I was just reading an article about, some predictions that, one futurist or another was saying that, with the absence of office towers, so we have, or so not the towers, but with the absence of the workers in these office towers, and the fact that there's lots of predictions that say we'll never go back to the full capacity that we had. And that many of these are going to be turned into communities as opposed to offices. How do we right now, as we're envisioning this future, start to build vibrant communities that can serve these downtowns? Because, cities are unique environments.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. We talk about people leaving, and, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, that yes, their tax base is, leaving with them. And some of the investments in the city that they make. I also think that it's creating space, right? I think that there has been a huge presence of grassroots leaders, of city builders, of just leaders, like people who are doing amazing things to hold up the social infrastructure of the city, that there has been no space to recognize their work because the sort of more technocratic, like the capital P professionals rule. And now as they leave the city, there's a gentleman in the US, Rashad Robinson, who runs an organization called The Color of Change, and he always talks about converting presence into power. And I've just fallen in love with this idea, which is power sort of being the ability to influence or shape or change systems, right? And so, to me, I think this is a moment for our institutions that make decisions about our city to say, well, who wants to step into the space? Because there are so many leaders, right? Like, this is the thing that's been so great, is that because so much of the grassroots work had such a deep impact, there's all these people that I've known forever who are finally now getting recognized. And I'm like, see.
Wait, what do you imagine it's going to look like? Like, so like,
Yeah.
let's just play for a moment. What could that look like? Well, like, as you look out 2 to 3 years, what do you think is going to come from this? Like, what, let's pretend.
I mean, I think there's a few things. One is that this like fetishization of downtown will be over, like this, there's so much happening in our city. There are so many communities that are incredible. One of the things I've worked in communities all over the city, neighborhood improvement areas all over the city. And one of the things we always talk about is how growing up in a neighborhood improvement area, which is sort of an economically disadvantaged area in Toronto that's been experienced sort of underinvestment, that young people in those communities always want to come downtown. They want to get out of the neighborhood and come downtown.
Right.
And, I think because none of us can travel, and so many people haven't really explored Toronto during the pandemic, they're like, discovering Scarborough and Thorncliffe Park's food scene, and, all those things are happening. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to open the aperture of where sort of the centers are. There's going to be a pluralism. There's going to be a plurality in terms of where are sort of the nodes in the city, and sort of depart from this idea that the center of the city is where decisions get made and the activity happens, and the economy is sort of the rest of the city is fueled by the center. I really love this idea that we are recognizing that there is so much beautiful activity happening across the city, and we can explore multiple centers, which is one thing. I think the other thing is that, and I've talked a little bit about this, but, in crises, we always respond with technocratic solutions, plans, right? Recovery plan, all these different, and I do think that one of the things I've been really enjoying is watching the municipality deal with emergence. And, we can have plans, but let's also make space to respond to needs as they come up. And I think that on the other side of this, I hope that we can have a city that is responsive, that is not married to plans, right? It's, there's so many transit plans and that were made like 30, 40 years ago that are now being realized, right? And the needs of those communities have changed. And I think the pandemic, from an institutional perspective, it forced our major institutions like our municipality and other levels of government to sort of adapt and say, maybe that plan didn't work and maybe we should think about reinvesting somewhere else. And so I really hope for a city that one can have sort of more organized and more prominent community voice to say needs are changing. Here's what they are. Here's what we'd like to see, or here's how we'd like to see them designed. And there's an example of the Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee and their incredible fearless leader Sabina Ali, who worked really closely when there was a whole bunch of newcomers in that community to get a tandoor oven in their park.
Oh,
And everyone
wow.
holds it up I mean, it's amazing. It's like
Yeah.
amazing. It's like, we
I
have the
need to
bake
go there.
ovens in Dufferin Grove. We have a tandoor oven in Thorncliffe Park. I think there's one in Regent Park as well now. But what I think I want for our post sort of pandemic city is that like those kinds of things happen all over the city, right?
Yeah.
This sort of infrastructure that's responding to need in this cool and emergent way.
What I think is so brilliant about that, like again, as I think about this, this moment right now, people are searching for places to find community, suddenly, here in Toronto, after 100 days of lockdown, we can go outside for non-essential things for the
Yeah.
first time, right? And so we're searching for that social connection in a safe way. So the idea of having like a tandoori oven in an outdoor park that community can use, suddenly it gives us, we know communities come together over food. That has been, for a millennia, that has been true.
Yeah.
And so here we are, we're reemerging from our homes and creating those types of communal spaces in the outdoor, because that's what we need to do right now. But in the future as well, because, one of the things that cities had been really good at was compartmentalizing people.
Yes.
We compartmentalized ourselves into apartments and condos and homes, and then to some degree in communities. But it sounds like, as we start to look forward, that maybe we're looking at the decompartmentalization of cities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we, I don't think and when I say we, I mean, institutions that influence the development of the city, um, I think they don't think in interconnected systems, right? It's not an ecology.
Right,
It's
right,
whack-a-mole,
right.
and you solve one
Yeah.
problem and another one emerges over there. And it's, there's so many incredible organizations in our city, like the Wells Institute, that look at the social determinants of health, right? It's like you can't just deal with the actual acute health issue. You have to understand if people have mental health supports, education, access to green space, employment opportunities,
Hmm.
community, right? Like friends, like family. And so if you just deal with the acute health issue without thinking about that ecosystem around them, you're not actually supporting people into sort of wellness. And I
Right.
think it's the same thing, right? In the city is that I think what happened at the start of the pandemic was all levels of government started issuing responses, but then other issues emerged, right?
Right.
And
Right.
they started to see, oh, you got to invest in both at the same time. You got to invest in, the piece around mental health support as much as you're like doing employment support and getting dollars in people's bank. Both very important, but get them both at the same time. So I think, to me, I hope that holds, right? I hope our
Yeah.
memory is long because our memory can be short.
Oh,
And I really hope that we remember that that was, that's always going to happen. It's just more pronounced right now. And especially, right, you look in Toronto where the impacts on racialized communities, like they felt they, bore the brunt of the job losses, the housing, evictions, the actual incidences of COVID, right? And so, for these communities, it was, you know, the compounding barriers were exacerbated,
right.
right? That
Right.
were already there. And so, you know, I would hope that we could do two things on the other side. One is we can feel confident saying everyone needs support, but some people need it more than others. We're so scared to prioritize as a city to
Mhm.
say because everyone's struggling. And I hope that we can look, and in that look at sort of racialized communities in our city and vulnerable communities in our city first and be okay with that. And then I do hope we can start more consistently thinking about the ecology of our city, not
Mm.
just the whack-a-mole issue addressing acute issues.
Yeah, I think you bring up such an important point there on the whack-a-mole one, because it's true, right? Like we do tend to, and I think it's, it's not just in cities. I think that tends to be a response in anything where we're
Right.
constantly like, let's solve this problem. Oh, we didn't see where it was going to impact somewhere else. And I think that is that's an impact, or that is an issue of leadership, in terms of like,
Mm.
leadership gets pressured to find a response, to find a solution.
Yeah.
And when we look at the leadership in our cities, and cities are governed through political leadership, and that those are elected positions, but yet I know we see that shifting depending on where the like we see the way in which the governance is happening, the numbers within those governance. It all shifts depending on what the city's needs are, or what the funding is. And as you think about going forward, because you talked a little bit about it earlier, about we're seeing some tax dollars being removed from the system, as we're seeing businesses start to shift and move, as we're seeing people leave the cities right now in this moment. And I think there's some fear around, will the tax dollars come back, will things equalize and momentum come back? So as you think about, the future of our cities, and certainly the way in which they're governed, is there
Mm.
any thoughts on the governance of our cities and what needs to change there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole 40 minutes slash 10 hours in itself. But I think, the thing I will say, to go back to the mutual aid networks, which I've been involved in, and so fascinated by. They've, existed forever, but their renewed importance during the pandemic, cannot be underscored enough. And Gia Tolentino in the New Yorker wrote this incredible piece on the organizing structure. So how, like, the hierarchical kind of organizational top-down model around, municipalities, charities, philanthropic organizations, and how the sort of mutual aid networks, they are they're truly bottom up in their leadership, in that they're serving the community, they're checking out what are sort of our priority needs, then they're serving the community again and saying, who's in a position to respond? Like, who's in a position in this moment to be the
Mhm.
most responsive to the fact that most people are
Wow.
experiencing food insecurity? They address the issue, the leadership shows up, and then they're serving again. And they're saying, okay, we have a new need now around housing. Is there someone who's better served to be a leader?
Mm.
So it's this constant sort of embedded humility, that we have to acknowledge the edge of our intelligence. We have to acknowledge where we don't know what we don't know, and put someone in a leadership position who can sort of better connect to the resources and the knowledge and all those different things we need to be of service to this current issue. Um, and so I think that there's something really interesting to learn from that, right? Which is, more humble leadership that looks at, you know, sort of how do we acknowledge when there's someone better suited to lead?
Well,
We're so
you know what?
bad at that.
As you're saying that, like, what came to my mind right away is, it's like, is that the end of, are we moving towards the end of the mayorship? Is that like right now, I mean, cities have been governed in the way that they've been governed for as long as cities have been around, I guess. I don't even know when the politicalization of cities began, but what I do know is that it came out of a need to have some sort of a person who spoke for the group, the community. And as you were saying that about, like, okay, who's the emerging leader, because who in this moment for this problem has the best solution. And there's something very I think very wise in that. And I think there are many different different industries that are starting to look at that type of, and it's almost a circular leadership pattern, where it says, what we have are communities or groups of thought leaders, or groups of professionals who have very specific expertise. And then as the need arises, that expertise becomes the leader. And so why would that be any different in cities? It makes so much sense. And I think what's key there, and what I think is really important about what you said, is that you have to have the communities that have that expertise, right? So you have to encourage, you have to have a well developed civic infrastructure to be able to allow for those leaders to appear when the need is most prevalent.
You got
And
it.
I would say that what is happening right now is that that civic infrastructure has been very heavily impacted over this past year because it's been drawn upon without the deposits put into it in the
Exactly.
past.
Yeah, and I think, to that point, I think this is where, democratic reform becomes a city building issue, right? Like we have if you're in Toronto, you know that we've halved our city council without extra investment in those offices. So, we've got a bunch of folks running, where their constituencies are massive. They've doubled in size. And how are they expected, even the ones who were super engaged, how are they expected to have that sort of deep
Right.
nuanced community insight? And so the idea, I'm working on a project right now with Dave Meslin where we're looking at what's that layer in between sort of residents associations and grassroots groups and organizing that's happening in neighborhoods and the counselor. And there's precedents all over the world. Los Angeles has an Office of Neighborhood Empowerment that is elected councils in their different wards. That work with all those grassroots groups to create a vision, prioritize needs, communicate clearly, and represent the diverse uses, right, of a community. I think that's also my wish for the other side of the city is that homeowners don't rule, right? Lots of people use our communities in different ways. They sleep in them, they have family in them, they have a park that brings them peace. They have, people are connected to the places that, we live. Without having sort of traditional and formal connections that we've traditionally leaned on
Mhm.
to determine the future of a community. And so I really think if we expand who's involved in sort of surveying the needs of the community and building that social infrastructure and surfacing community voice, we start to sort of push on the edge of democratic reform. And we maybe still have a mayor, but the mayor is well informed and is a facilitator and is sort of pulling
Yeah.
together that key information and communicating it back to say, here's where we are versus this is what we are.
Yeah, I think what it's so wise what you're suggesting, which is, the mayor goes from being the not, I mean, there's always a democracy in a city. It's not like there's an autocracy that the mayor is making all the decisions. But, the way that they're set up right now, the mayor's job is to make the best decision based on the information he's given. Whereas what you're suggesting is that you allow for the mayor to pull in those experts and they make the decisions. And,
Yeah.
and that like, how can one person ever be, have to have to know everything about everything, even though you've got advisors, they still have to be the one big decision maker. And it's such an unfair thing. So, because cities are so diverse. And I think we come back to where we started, right? Where the diversity of the city, where the infrastructure within a city, the hard infrastructure, the social infrastructure, these are places where as we evolve, we can't just think about the hard infrastructure. That social infrastructure has to be paid attention to.
Well, and if all of this is going to work, I know we're running low on time, but the last thing I will say is for everything I've said to work, we have to open the aperture of who is legitimate, right? Like I think that's been the thing is that, City Hall has been the domain of professionals, policymakers, uh, politicians, researchers, and amazing folks. Like I'm not saying that they need to go away, but to say we need to expand the definition of who has legitimate capacity and whose data is relevant. And I think pulling on stories and qualitative data and all of the great things that grassroots leaders do in our cities, we have to recognize that that leadership is as important as all of the other professional practices that sort of show up traditionally at City Hall, because all of the things we've talked about cannot come to life if we don't redefine legitimacy in terms of who's equipped to be a decision maker.
Wow, that is such a note to end on. Like incredible, because I think that is the point, right?
Yeah.
Our cities can only grow as we are allow them to identify and elevate those who have the knowledge to best build them so that our social infrastructure and our hard infrastructure meet the needs of all of us who live within them.
Yeah.
Zahra, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for asking the questions.
Oh, no
They're important
problem.
questions to be asking right now. So thank you.
And thank you to our audience who joined us today. Really appreciate you all joining us. And this brings us to an end of today's conversation. Join us next week for another. Have an amazing rest of your day. And thanks again, Zahra, for helping us all move forward through this challenging time.
Thank you.